They tried to erase her from history. A teenage queen executed after just 9 days on the throne. Another wore makeup so toxic it killed her from the inside out. And one queen's belly swelled for 11 months with a baby that never existed. What you think you know about England's queens is a lie. The real stories involve secret lovers, brutal executions, and scandals so shocking they were hidden for centuries. You won't believe what they did to survive in a world that wanted them dead. Warning, fact number 14 will change everything you thought you knew about royalty. Let's begin with a woman who should have been England's first ruling queen, but never quite made it. Her name was Matilda, and her story shows us just how brutal medieval prejudice could be. Born in 1102 as the daughter of King Henry I, Matilda seemed destined for greatness from the very start. When she was only 8 years old, she was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. This wasn't unusual for the time. Royal children were essentially political tools, married off to forge alliances between kingdoms. What was unusual, however, was how successful Matilda became in her role. She wasn't just a decorative figure at court. When her husband went off to war, which happened frequently, Matilda served as regent. That means she was essentially running the Holy Roman Empire in his absence. She made decisions, settled disputes, and proved that she had the intelligence and strength to lead. In Germany, where the emperor's word was absolute law, Matilda learned to wield power without hesitation or apology. Everything changed in 1120, when tragedy struck the English royal family. Matilda's brother William was traveling back to England on a ship called the White Ship when disaster occurred. The ship hit a rock and sank in the freezing waters of the English Channel. William drowned along with many other nobles. This shipwreck, though it might seem like a small footnote in history, actually altered the entire course of England's future. With William dead, King Henry I suddenly had no male heir. His only legitimate child left was Matilda. King Henry made a decision that was revolutionary for his time. He declared that Matilda would inherit the throne after his death. He forced his barons, the powerful nobles who controlled much of England's land and military might, to swear oaths of loyalty to her. They did so, but their reluctance was obvious. These men had been raised to believe that women were inferior, incapable of making tough decisions, and too emotional to lead in times of war. The idea of bowing to a queen was almost unthinkable to them. When King Henry died in 1135, Matilda was in Anjou, a region in what is now France. She couldn't get to England quickly enough. Her cousin Stephen of Blois saw his opportunity and seized it. He raced to London, claimed the throne, and had himself crowned king before Matilda could even respond. The barons who had sworn to support Matilda suddenly backed Stephen instead. Why? Many historians believe they saw Stephen as weak and easy to manipulate. They thought they could control him in ways they could never control the strong-willed Matilda. What followed was one of the most devastating civil wars in English history. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by fighting between Matilda's supporters and Stephen's forces. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and ordinary people suffered terribly. Medieval chroniclers called this period the Anarchy, because law and order essentially broke down across much of the country. Matilda proved to be a formidable military leader. In 1141, her forces captured Stephen in battle, and she had him imprisoned. She marched to London to be crowned as England's first queen regnant. This should have been her moment of triumph. Finally, after years of fighting, she would take what was rightfully hers. But this is where Matilda's story takes a tragic turn that reveals the impossible situation medieval women faced. The problem was Matilda's personality, or more specifically, how her personality was perceived. In Germany, she had learned to rule with absolute authority. The emperor never apologized, never explained himself, never negotiated. He simply commanded and expected obedience. Matilda brought this same style to England, but England was different. The barons expected to have a say in how they were governed. They demanded certain rights and privileges. When Matilda arrived in London, They asked her to swear a coronation oath that would limit her powers and protect their interests. Matilda refused. To her, this must have seemed absurd. Why should she, the rightful heir to the throne, have to make promises to her own subjects? But her refusal was a catastrophic political mistake. The Londoners, who had never really warmed to her anyway, turned against her. They drove her out of the city before she could be formally crowned. What happened next was almost comical in its speed. The barons released Stephen from prison and put him back on the throne. Matilda's reign, if you can even call it that, had lasted only a few months. Matilda never gave up the fight entirely, but she never wore the crown again either. Eventually, exhausted by years of warfare, both sides agreed to a compromise. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but when he died, the throne would pass to Matilda's son Henry. In 1154, that's exactly what happened. Henry became King Henry II, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for centuries. So why did Matilda fail where her son succeeded? The answer is simple and infuriating: gender. Henry was no more qualified than his mother. He wasn't smarter or braver or more diplomatic, but he was male. And in the 12th century, that made all the difference. The same behavior that was called arrogant in Matilda would have been praised as strong leadership in a man. Her refusal to negotiate would have been seen as kingly confidence rather than stubborn pride. Matilda's story matters because it shows us how talented women were crushed by societies that refused to accept them. She had proven herself capable of ruling an empire. She had the legitimate right to England's throne. She had the military skill to win battles and the political acumen to govern. None of it mattered because she was born female in an era that couldn't imagine a woman in power. Now let's move forward about 400 years to another young woman who found herself trapped by forces beyond her control. Lady Jane Grey was just 16 years old when she became queen, and she lasted even less time than Matilda, only 9 days to be exact. Jane's tragedy began with religion. By the mid-1500s, England had broken away from the Catholic Church under King Henry VIII. His son Edward VI was a devout Protestant who feared what would happen when he died. His half-sister Mary was next in line for the throne, and Mary was Catholic. Edward worried that she would undo all the religious reforms and bring England back under the Pope's control. So Edward, though he was dying and probably not thinking clearly, came up with a plan. He would bypass Mary entirely. He declared both his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, illegitimate and named Lady Jane Grey as his heir instead. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, which gave her a blood connection to the royal family, though not a particularly strong one. When Jane heard that she was to be queen, she fainted. This wasn't a dramatic gesture. She genuinely didn't want the crown. Jane was a scholar who loved reading and studying. She spoke multiple languages and spent her time discussing theology with learned men. The last thing she wanted was to be thrust into the violent world of Tudor politics. But she had no choice. Her family and the powerful men around Edward forced her to accept. Jane's reign began on July 10, 1553, when Edward died. It ended on July 19th, when Mary's forces marched on London. The English people, whatever their religious beliefs, recognized Mary as Henry VIII's legitimate daughter. They felt that Edward's attempt to change the succession was illegal. Mary easily gathered an army, and the men who had put Jane on the throne fled for their lives. Even Jane's own father abandoned her. Mary didn't want to execute Jane at first. She recognized that the girl was just a pawn in someone else's game. But in 1554, a rebellion broke out with the goal of putting Jane back on the throne. Mary, frightened that Jane would always be a rallying point for Protestant rebels, signed her death warrant. On February 12, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was beheaded. She was 16 years old. She had been queen for 9 days and never wanted to be queen at all. The story of Mary I is one that most people think they know. She's remembered by a nickname that has terrified children for generations: Bloody Mary. The name conjures images of a cruel tyrant burning innocent people alive for their religious beliefs. And while it's true that Mary ordered the execution of hundreds of Protestants during her 5-year reign, the full story is far more complicated and heartbreaking than the simple villain narrative suggests. Mary was born in 1516 as the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife Catherine of Aragon. For the first 11 years of her life, Mary was a beloved princess, the heir to the English throne. Her parents doted on her, and she received an excellent education. But everything fell apart when her father became obsessed with Anne Boleyn. Henry desperately wanted a male heir, something Catherine had failed to provide after multiple pregnancies that ended in miscarriages or stillborn children. His only surviving child was Mary, and in his mind, that wasn't good enough. Henry's attempts to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn led to England's break from the Catholic Church. The Pope refused to annul the marriage, so Henry simply declared himself the head of a new Church of England. He divorced Catherine anyway, married Anne, and declared Mary illegitimate. Overnight, Mary went from being a princess to being nobody. She was separated from her mother and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting for her new baby half-sister Elizabeth. The psychological damage of this humiliation stayed with Mary for the rest of her life. Catherine died in 1536, probably from cancer, and Mary was forbidden from seeing her mother in her final days. Then Anne Boleyn was executed, and Henry married again and again and again. Mary watched as her father went through 6 wives, always searching for the male heir who would secure his dynasty. When Henry's third wife Jane Seymour finally gave birth to a son, Edward, Mary found herself even further from the throne. After Henry died in 1547, 9-year-old Edward became king with a council of Protestant advisors running the country. They pushed England further away from Catholic practices, and Mary, who had remained devoutly Catholic throughout everything, was increasingly isolated and persecuted. She held secret masses in her own home, defying orders to conform to the new Protestant religion. When Edward died in 1553, and Mary finally became queen at the age of 37, she saw it as her divine mission to save England's soul by bringing it back to Catholicism. The burnings began in 1555. Over the course of her reign, approximately 280 Protestants were executed by being burned at the stake. This was not unusual for the time period. Both Catholic and Protestant rulers across Europe were executing their religious opponents in horrific ways. But Mary's actions were particularly remembered because England would soon become a Protestant country again under Elizabeth, and Protestant historians made sure to emphasize Mary's cruelty. They wrote books describing the deaths in graphic detail, with illustrations showing the suffering of the martyrs. This propaganda is why Mary got her infamous nickname and why it stuck for centuries. But while Mary was trying to save souls through fire, her personal life was falling apart in ways that were truly tragic. She married Philip II of Spain in 1554, and by all accounts, she fell deeply in love with him. Philip did not feel the same way. He had married Mary for political reasons, to create an alliance between Spain and England. He found her unattractive and boring, and he spent as little time in England as possible, preferring to be back in Spain or fighting wars on the European continent. Mary's desperation for a child consumed her. She needed an heir, not just because she wanted to be a mother, but because without one, the throne would pass to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, undoing everything Mary had worked for. The pressure was enormous. In 1554, Mary's abdomen began to swell, and she announced that she was pregnant. The entire country waited for the birth of an heir. Preparations were made, nurseries were set up, announcements were drafted. But months passed and no baby came. Mary insisted she was pregnant. She could feel the child moving, she said. Her doctors agreed that she showed all the signs of pregnancy. The court waited through what should have been 9 months, then 10 months, then 11 months. Still no baby. Eventually, Mary's stomach began to shrink, and it became clear that there had never been a pregnancy at all. Modern medical experts believe Mary was suffering from what's called a phantom pregnancy, a psychological condition where a woman experiences pregnancy symptoms, including a swollen abdomen, even though no baby exists. This can be triggered by an overwhelming desire to become pregnant combined with extreme stress. Other historians suggest she may have had ovarian cysts or tumors that caused the swelling. Whatever the medical explanation, the public humiliation must have been devastating. The entire country knew that their queen had announced a pregnancy that never materialized. Philip left England and rarely returned. Mary tried again in 1557, believing herself pregnant once more, but again, no child came. Her health deteriorated rapidly. She likely had uterine cancer, which would explain both the abdominal swelling and her inability to conceive. She died in November 1558 at the age of 42, alone and unloved by her husband, having failed to produce an heir. The contrast between the image of Bloody Mary the monster and Mary the desperate, heartbroken woman is striking. She did terrible things in the name of religion, ordering the deaths of people whose only crime was believing differently than she did. Those actions cannot be excused. But she was also a woman who spent her entire life fighting for recognition, who was cast aside and humiliated by her father, who never knew real love, and who died knowing that everything she had worked for would be undone the moment her Protestant sister took the throne. And that brings us to Elizabeth, perhaps the most famous queen in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled for 45 years and transformed England into a major European power. But behind the iconic image of Good Queen Bess lies a story filled with tragedy, toxic beauty standards, and a complicated love life that contradicts her famous virgin status. Elizabeth was born in 1533, and her early life was marked by trauma. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, beheaded on charges of adultery and treason that were almost certainly false. Like her sister Mary before her, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. She grew up knowing that her father had killed her mother, and that her own life was constantly in danger. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth lived under suspicion. Mary feared that Protestant rebels would rally around Elizabeth, so the young princess was constantly watched and at times imprisoned. Elizabeth learned to be careful, to never reveal her true thoughts, to tell people what they wanted to hear, while keeping her real feelings hidden. These skills would serve her well when she became queen in 1558 at age 25. As queen, Elizabeth faced enormous pressure to marry and produce an heir. Parliament begged her repeatedly to choose a husband. Foreign princes and English nobles competed for her hand, but Elizabeth refused them all, famously declaring that she was married to England. This is where the Virgin Queen legend comes from. But the reality was far more complex. The great love of Elizabeth's life was probably Robert Dudley, a man she had known since childhood. In the early years of her reign, Elizabeth showered Dudley with attention and gifts. She made him the Earl of Leicester and gave him unprecedented access to her private chambers. There was just one problem. Dudley was already married to a woman named Amy Robsart. In 1560, Amy Robsart died in suspicious circumstances. She was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. The official verdict was an accident, but rumors immediately spread that Dudley had murdered his wife so he could marry the queen. Some even whispered that Elizabeth herself had been involved in the plot. These rumors were so damaging that Elizabeth could never marry Dudley without destroying her reputation entirely. Yet they remained close for decades, with Dudley remaining one of her most trusted advisors until his death in 1588. Then there was the strange courtship with the Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the French king. Elizabeth was in her mid-40s when this relationship began, and Anjou was 20 years younger. She seemed genuinely attracted to him, and even gave him a pet name, calling him her frog. She went so far as to exchange rings with him publicly and announce that she would marry him. But the very next day, she called the whole thing off. Whether this was political theater or genuine indecision, we'll never know. The last and most tragic of Elizabeth's romantic entanglements was with Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Essex was young, handsome, and charming when their relationship began in 1589. Elizabeth was 56. The age gap raised eyebrows, but Elizabeth seemed captivated by the young earl. She gave him important military commands despite his lack of experience. Essex was also arrogant and reckless. He repeatedly disrespected the queen, and in one famous incident, she slapped him across the face and told him to go hang himself. Yet she kept forgiving him and bringing him back into favor. The relationship finally ended in catastrophe when Essex led a failed rebellion in 1601. He stormed into Elizabeth's bedchamber early one morning, seeing her without her makeup and wig, an unthinkable breach of protocol. Shortly after, he attempted to seize control of London and force Elizabeth to make him her chief advisor. The rebellion failed, and Elizabeth had no choice but to order his execution. On February 25, 1601, Essex was beheaded. Elizabeth reportedly agonized over signing his death warrant, but she did it anyway. Her famous statement was that while she could forgive what he had done to her personally, she could never forgive anyone who tried to harm England. Moving forward in time, we come to a period in English history that fundamentally changed how monarchs ruled. The late 17th century saw a dramatic shift in power, away from absolute monarchy toward parliamentary control. At the center of this transformation was Mary II, a queen who shared her throne with her husband and kept quiet about secrets that could have destroyed the monarchy's reputation. Mary was born in 1662 as the daughter of James II, who was then the Duke of York and heir to his brother King Charles II. She was raised Protestant despite her father's conversion to Catholicism, which would later become crucially important. When Mary was just 15 years old, she was married to her cousin William of Orange, the leader of the Netherlands. By all accounts, Mary was initially unhappy with this arranged marriage. William was short, suffered from asthma, and seemed cold and distant. But over time, she appears to have developed genuine affection for him, even though the marriage produced no children. The real drama began when Mary's father became King James II in 1685. James was openly Catholic and began appointing Catholics to important positions in government and the military. This terrified Protestant England, which had spent the past century and a half fighting over religion. The country had endured Henry VIII's break with Rome, the Protestant reforms under Edward VI, the Catholic Restoration under Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth's Protestant settlement. Nobody wanted to go through religious upheaval again. Things reached a crisis point in 1688 when James's second wife gave birth to a son. This boy would be raised Catholic and would inherit the throne ahead of Mary and her Protestant sister Anne. A group of powerful English nobles decided they had had enough. They secretly invited Mary and William to invade England and take the throne. This invitation is one of the most unusual moments in English history. Rather than fighting to keep a foreign invader out, the English establishment was actively asking foreigners to conquer them. William sailed from the Netherlands with an army, and James's support simply collapsed. His own army deserted him, and he fled to France without putting up a fight. This became known as the Glorious Revolution because it accomplished a complete change of government with almost no bloodshed. But there was nothing glorious about it from Mary's perspective. She had just helped overthrow her own father. Parliament seized this opportunity to completely redefine the relationship between monarch and government. They offered the crown to William and Mary jointly, but only after the couple agreed to significant conditions. The Bill of Rights of 1689 established that Parliament, not the monarch, had the ultimate authority. The king and queen could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain a standing army without parliamentary consent. Freedom of speech in Parliament was guaranteed. This was a revolutionary moment. The monarch was no longer an absolute ruler, but rather a constitutional figurehead who governed with Parliament's permission. William and Mary accepted these terms and became joint monarchs. However, William made it clear that he had no intention of being a mere consort. He demanded equal power, and since he commanded the army that had made the revolution possible, he got it. In practice, though, William spent most of his time in the Netherlands dealing with wars against France. Mary was left to actually run England, which she did competently and conscientiously. Mary proved to be an effective ruler during William's long absences. She took her duties seriously and worked hard to maintain religious tolerance and political stability. She was personally devout and supported the Church of England, while also believing that Protestant dissenters should be allowed to worship freely. Her relatively short reign saw England transitioning smoothly into its new constitutional arrangement. Then tragedy struck. In December 1694, Mary contracted smallpox. The disease progressed rapidly, and she died on December 28th at the age of just 32. She had been queen for only 5 years. William was reportedly devastated by her death, which surprised many who had thought their marriage was purely political. He ruled alone for another 8 years until his own death in 1702. But here's where Mary's story takes a turn into territory that was scandalous for the time and remained hushed up for generations. After Mary's death, rumors began to circulate about William's private life. Specifically, people whispered that William was more interested in men than women, and that Mary had known about it throughout their marriage. William had several male favorites who received extraordinary privileges. One was Arnold Joost van Keppel, a young Dutch soldier who became one of the wealthiest men in England thanks to William's lavish gifts of land and titles. Another was Hans Willem Bentinck, who had been William's closest companion since childhood and who received similar preferential treatment. William even had a secret passage built connecting his bedchamber directly to the rooms of one of these young men, allowing private visits without being seen by servants or courtiers. The English nobility resented these Dutch favorites intensely, not just because of the implied sexual relationship, but because William was giving away English lands and wealth to foreigners. Mary's own sister Anne, who would become the next queen, reportedly made a cutting remark that she wasn't worried about William remarrying and having children, because his heart was not inclined toward women, but was occupied by men. Whether William was actually homosexual or bisexual, or whether these were simply intense friendships that appeared inappropriate to outsiders, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Mary never spoke publicly about any of this. She maintained a dignified silence about her husband's male companions, even as court gossip swirled around her. She played her role as queen and wife without complaint, putting duty to the crown above any personal feelings she might have had. Mary's situation illustrates the impossible position that queens often found themselves in. They were expected to produce heirs, support their husbands, and maintain the dignity of the crown, all while having essentially no power over their own circumstances. If Mary was unhappy in her marriage or troubled by William's relationships with other men, she had no recourse. Divorce was unthinkable for royalty. Complaining publicly would have caused a scandal. So she did what royal women had always done. She kept quiet, did her duty, and died young. When Mary died, the throne passed solely to William until his death, and then to Mary's sister Anne. And Anne's story might be the most heartbreaking of all the queens we're discussing today. Queen Anne was born in 1665, just 3 years after her sister Mary. Like Mary, she was raised Protestant despite their father's Catholicism. Anne married Prince George of Denmark in 1683, and by all accounts, theirs was a happy marriage, which makes the tragedy that followed even more painful. Anne became pregnant 17 times over the course of her marriage. 17 times she went through pregnancy hoping to give birth to a healthy child who would survive. The results were devastating. Most of her pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Several babies were born alive but died within hours or days. The longest surviving of her children was Prince William, who lived to the age of 11 before dying of smallpox in 1700. Modern medical historians have examined the historical records of Anne's pregnancies and believe she suffered from a condition called Hughes syndrome, also known as antiphospholipid syndrome. This is an autoimmune disorder where the blood clots too easily, which can cause recurrent miscarriages and stillbirths. The same condition also explained many of Anne's other health problems. She suffered from terrible pain, chronic inflammation, and eventually became so disabled that she had to be carried around in a chair. The truly tragic part is that Hughes syndrome can be managed with modern medicine. A simple medication like aspirin, which thins the blood, could likely have prevented most of Anne's miscarriages and allowed her to have healthy children. But medical science in the early 18th century had no understanding of blood disorders. Anne endured pregnancy after pregnancy, each one ending in grief, with no one able to tell her why. The death of Prince William in 1700 created a major succession crisis. Anne was now queen, having succeeded William III in 1702, but she had no living children and was unlikely to have any more given her age and poor health. Parliament needed to ensure that the throne wouldn't return to a Catholic after Anne's death. They passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, which established that the crown would go to Sophia of Hanover, a Protestant granddaughter of James I, or her descendants. No Catholic could inherit the throne, and male heirs would be preferred over females. Anne's reign saw another major constitutional change. In 1707, the Act of Union formally merged England and Scotland into a single kingdom called Great Britain. This ended centuries of separate Scottish and English crowns and created the political entity that still exists today. But while Anne was managing affairs of state, her personal life remained turbulent. She had intense female friendships that some historians believe may have been romantic relationships. The most important was with Sarah Churchill, a beautiful and charismatic woman who became one of the most powerful people in England. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, was a brilliant military commander, and together the couple essentially controlled access to the Queen. The 19th century brought us Queen Victoria, a woman whose name became synonymous with an entire era. The Victorian age conjures images of strict morality, industrial progress, and an empire that stretched across the globe. But the woman behind this legacy lived a life marked by isolation, grief, and a love so profound that its loss nearly destroyed her. Victoria was born in 1819 as the only child of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who died when she was just 8 months old. Her childhood was anything but happy. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, was domineering and controlling, keeping Victoria isolated from other children and supervising her every moment. Victoria wasn't even allowed to sleep in her own room. She had to share her mother's bedroom until she became queen at age 18. This system of control, which historians call the Kensington system, was designed by Victoria's mother and her advisor John Conroy to keep the young princess dependent and malleable. The Duchess of Kent saw her daughter as a ticket to power and wealth. She assumed that when Victoria became queen, she would naturally defer to her mother's judgment and allow her mother to effectively rule through her. But the Duchess badly underestimated her daughter's strength of will. The moment Victoria became queen in 1837, she asserted her independence. She refused to give her mother any political role and moved her into separate apartments far from her own rooms. After 18 years of suffocating control, Victoria was finally free. 3 years into her reign, Victoria fell deeply in love with her German cousin Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. In a reversal of traditional gender roles, it was Victoria who proposed marriage to Albert. As queen, she had to be the one to ask. They married in 1840, and by all accounts, it was a genuinely happy marriage based on mutual love and respect. Together, they had 9 children, though Victoria famously complained about pregnancy and childbirth, calling newborn babies ugly and saying she felt like a cow or a dog during pregnancy. Albert was not given the title of king, which frustrated him. Instead, he was made prince consort, essentially the queen's husband with no independent constitutional role. But Victoria relied heavily on Albert's advice and guidance. He helped modernize the royal finances, which had been in disarray. He organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, a massive showcase of industrial innovation and manufacturing that attracted millions of visitors to London and demonstrated Britain's technological superiority to the world. The Crystal Palace, built specifically to house this exhibition, became one of the architectural wonders of the age. But then disaster struck. In December 1861, Albert fell ill with typhoid fever. The disease progressed rapidly, and on December 14th, he died at Windsor Castle. He was just 42 years old. Victoria was absolutely devastated. She plunged into a grief so profound that it bordered on mental breakdown. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a full 40 years. She withdrew from public duties almost entirely, rarely appearing in public, and refusing to participate in the ceremonies and events that the public expected from their monarch. Victoria's extended mourning went far beyond what was considered normal, even by Victorian standards. She ordered that Albert's rooms be kept exactly as they were when he died. His clothes were laid out every day. Hot water was brought for his shaving every morning. It was as if she expected him to return at any moment. She communed with his spirit through mediums and became convinced that he was watching over her from beyond the grave. The British public grew increasingly frustrated with their absent queen. They were paying taxes to support the monarchy, but their monarch refused to work. Newspapers began printing critical articles asking what exactly Victoria was doing to earn her keep. Some even questioned whether Britain needed a monarchy at all. Republicans argued that the country could save money by becoming a republic. Victoria's popularity sank to dangerous lows. Her relationship with a Scottish servant named John Brown made things worse. Brown had been a gillie, an outdoor servant who helped with hunting and fishing, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. After Albert's death, Victoria became extremely close to Brown, relying on him for emotional support. He was rough, blunt, and treated the Queen with a familiarity that shocked the court. Rumors spread that Victoria had secretly married Brown, or that she was having an affair with him. Some newspapers mockingly called her Mrs. Brown instead of Queen Victoria. It took the intervention of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli to coax Victoria back into public life. Disraeli flattered her shamelessly and treated her with elaborate courtesy. He convinced her to take a more active role in government and to appear in public more often. In 1876, Disraeli arranged for Parliament to grant Victoria the title Empress of India, recognizing her rule over Britain's most valuable colonial possession. This new title seemed to revitalize Victoria. She began to see herself as the symbolic head of a vast global empire where the sun never set. Victoria's reign lasted 63 years, making her the longest reigning British monarch, until Elizabeth II surpassed her record in 2015. During Victoria's time on the throne, Britain reached the height of its power and influence. The Industrial Revolution transformed the country from an agricultural society into the workshop of the world. British colonies and territories circled the globe. British culture, language, and values spread to every continent. But Victoria's personal legacy carried a dark secret that would have devastating consequences for royal families across Europe. She was a carrier of hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. People with hemophilia can bleed to death from minor injuries. Victoria passed this gene to several of her children, who in turn passed it to their children. Her 9 children married into royal families across Europe, spreading the hemophilia gene far and wide. The most famous victim was Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, the son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. Alexandra was Victoria's granddaughter and had inherited the hemophilia gene from her mother. Young Alexei suffered terribly from the disease, experiencing agonizing bleeding episodes that could be triggered by the slightest bump or fall. His illness helped bring the infamous Rasputin into the Russian royal family, as the mystic seemed to have some ability to ease the boy's suffering. The political chaos surrounding Rasputin contributed to the Russian Revolution, and ultimately the entire Russian royal family was executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. Victoria died in 1901 at the age of 81, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her death marked the end of an era in more ways than one. The world she had known, a world of empires and monarchy and rigid social hierarchies, was about to be shattered by the First World War. Finally, we come to Elizabeth II, who became the longest reigning monarch in British history and guided the monarchy through the tumultuous changes of the 20th and 21st centuries. Elizabeth was born in 1926, the daughter of Prince Albert, Duke of York. She was never supposed to be queen. Her uncle Edward was heir to the throne, and everyone assumed he would marry, have children, and those children would eventually inherit the crown.